Hello and welcome once again, Greenwood and Wildwood Tarrowers. Mark Ryan here. Welcome once more into adventures in the Greenwood and the Wildwood. Thank you again for all the lovely messages I've had regarding support for this idea and the whole concept. I really appreciate it. Thank you. And I know this is going to sound strange, but when you've done as many interviews and talks and lectures and all kinds of stuff, panels, regarding this stuff, you think that people, they've all heard it before. So, you forget that people either forget themselves or they've never heard this before. So, I'm going to just reiterate some of the history regarding how this all came to be, which might explain some of my involvement in not just the tarot, but the whole esoteric world. And hopefully that will clear up some questions for folks that people are interested to know how this, how this formed. So let me just go back a little ways. We recently found, my sister Sandra found a picture. This is the first time I had a bow in my hands in Doncaster, where I was born, and that is me with my father and my sister. And as you can see, I'll post this later on, I'll scan it and post it. I was always born with a bow and arrow in my hands, and at that point the bow was like over a foot taller than I was. But anyway, I'm not sure if my brother's ever forgiven me for shooting him in the eye, but or was it the mouth? I can't remember. Anyway, so I was born literally into archery and swords and the whole world of mythos in Yorkshire. As a boy, I played in Sherwood Forest and played in and around the Major Road, which nowadays you're not allowed in, but in those days you could just go there and climb in there, and we did. And I grew up with Conisbrough Castle, the castle from Ivanhoe, and Swapper Falls, the legends relating to that and the myths. York, the Knights Templars, the Romans, the Celts, Scarborough, Robin Hood's Bay, Robin Hood's Cave, Watling Street, Great North Road, Watling Street, Barnsley Dale. I grew up in the middle of all of that and somehow absorbed many of those stories and myths and legends related to both Arthur, funnily enough, and Robin Hood and various other heroes of the mythic, as well as hauntings and mystical places and magical places and Whitby and all that kind of stuff. I kind of grew up with all of that. It was just, I don't know, as a boy, as a child, I inherently just absorbed it into my psyche, and it became something that I stored in the back of my head and said, one day I'll go back and have a look at that and explore that. And it was just there in my head. Now, fast forward, I guess, to 1980, I was playing Che Guevara in Ibiza. Originally I played Magallian, I played Che. I think it was around that time, it was my first trip to Los Angeles. And I was very kindly taken to a bookstore, which isn't there now, called the Bodhi Tree Bookstore, but a legendary place for those of you that have ever been there. I was taken there by some folks who were showing me around this place, and I have to say it was a magical place. And that is where I think I purchased my first tarot decks in 1980. Although I had handled tarot decks before, and I'd actually had my cards read before, the actual system and the mechanics of how it worked, obviously as a young man, just I was off pursuing other goals, but the whole the idea of tarot and what it meant, what it stood for, was there in my head. I just had not explored it fully. But I bought a couple of decks in California at the Bodhi Tree and tried to make sense of it for myself through the imagery in those cards and the system that they were based on. Now, this was not very successful. I couldn't access the art particularly, and the actual system, Kabbalah. For all you Kabbalah followers out there, you have my undying respect. It just doesn't work for me. I can't access it. I don't know why. It isn't a natural fit. And so I spent quite some time trying to get my head round Kabbalah and how it worked with the tarot cards, and it just somehow didn't work naturally for me, as well as studying lots of other esoteric pursuits, including obviously Jungian psychology. And funnily enough, at that point, I was still, even then, very interested in quantum physics and mechanics, the art of observing the particle, changing the particle, and that concept. So, as I was not affiliated with any organised religion, I was kind of free, as my father wanted me to do, to create avenues for myself into the spiritual world. So this is, I guess, how I did it. After that, I stored tarot away under, yes, nice eye thing, I'll come back to it at some point in the proceedings. And then came along an event, after leaving Avita and doing Who Dares Wins, came an event which changed many people's lives, not just mine, but a show called Robin of Sherwood. And many people call Richard Carpenter the father of modern day iconography regarding the horned figure of the forest, and all the legends related to Robin the Hood and the Hooded Man. And we spent 3 years, literally, I felt comfortable in this universe. It was something I was very happy being involved with for 3 years of my life, to the point where all the boys today are still very close. We were literally a band of brothers running around in the woods, being the merry men, with two quite amazing Robin Hoods. So that event, we all were aware, was changing lives and was going to become something that would be remembered, probably outlive us and our careers. Richard Carpenter, the writer, who was a brilliant visionary. I was not just a writer to me, he was a father figure and a very, very close friend. And magically, one of the most open and adept people I think I've ever met in my life. Many a night we would sit into the wee small hours discussing the imagery, the psychology of it all, because right from the very beginning, when he asked me about Nazir the Saracen and what ideas I had, which is unheard of now for a writer to ask an actor about ideas for a character, I'd read Runciman's History of the Crusades, all 3 volumes. So I understood and had studied the relationship between the Knights Templar and the cult of the Assassins. So it was something I already had in my head, and when we discussed all of that and this esoteric, medical and navigational techniques that the Assassins swapped with the Knights Templar and traded with them. So there was a whole esoteric history to this with Kip that I could explore, including obviously the Robin Hood legend and the legends attached to it and around it, as we did a show on King Arthur and various other things, which again was just a natural, and I will forever be indebted to Richard Carpenter for the stamp that he has made on this world regarding bringing this to the forefront. So a lot of stuff that's in both decks of cards, the Greenwood and the Wildwood, that is why in the book itself, the Greenwood Tarot, it is in fact dedicated to Richard Carpenter, for whom the fire burned brightly and warmed us all. Yes, Kip, wherever you are, thank you. So a lot of iconography and imagery that is in both of these works, lodged in my head, were fundamentally a piece of me discussing this concept with Richard Carpenter. After Robin of Sherwood, I found myself doing lots of various fan conventions, being invited to do talks about this subject, the esoteric elements within Robin of Sherwood, and it was already lodged in my head from a child. So I was able to discuss some of these things quite easily because it was there. I'd already done it, both for the character of Nazir and both because of my childhood in Yorkshire. And I was researching an Arthurian script that I was writing based on the Welsh legends. And I was running around the Brecon Beacons and Camden Valley, researching some of those old battlegrounds and the Iron Age hill forts, and had some of the most profound esoteric experiences of my life. And I'll come on to some of that in a different video, but that is where I discovered that there are strange things out there, and if you speak to them, they will talk to you. And sometimes they even throw things at you, which was quite an experience. But that period led on to me writing to Andy Collins, who was writing a book called Seven Swords, about his exploration of a real historical collection of swords called the Seven Swords of Mionai. So I wrote to Andy regarding this because there was a lot of parallels in what I was doing with what he was doing. He very kindly invited me to come along and observe and be a part of this exploration of this psychic questing. And if anybody's the father of psychic questing, it's Andy Collins, who brought it to, again, a much wider international audience. Some of these guys and gals were incredibly talented psychics, and I had some very interesting experiences with them, which I historically mentioned and noted and detailed in Andy's books, particularly The Seven Swords. So I go read the book, it's all in there. During that, I was also exploring some of the elements related to Ellen of the Ways and Ellen of the Wells. And depending on how you look at that, there are two different ways of looking at that legend. Caroline Wise, who worked with Cheska extensively on the whole Ellen mythos, well, is chapter and verse on this. She knows much more about it than I do. But Cheska's idea of it was that there was an original Ellen of the Ways, which was to do with the hunter-gatherer tribes following out migratory tracks through the forest, which then later morphed into St. Ellen of the Wheel and of the Roman St. Helena. So there's a lot of ways of looking at that particular different mythos and legend, and I was curious to which one and what the depth of how it related to Wales, and particularly the Brigantian culture, which ran from North Wales to Yorkshire. So Andy, in fact, suggested and introduced me to Cheska Potter. And that's how we started talking about bouncing ideas off. The iconography, Cheska was a huge Robin of Sherwood fan as well. I'm sure that it had affected her as well, and she told me that it did. So that iconography was something that we discussed at great length. The original idea, her idea, was to actually do a Robin of Sherwood tarot, which I wasn't against. I just thought it had issues that might be insurmountable, copyright issues. But also it was a very narrow in the sense that you have a small band of people and a small band of personality traits, and I didn't want to have to invent major arcana figures to fill in the holes within the group. And it's possible that there was enough characters in the show to do it, but for a 78 card pack I wanted to have a wider canvas to paint on. And so we discussed then widening it out to the whole ethos and not just doing up to Robin of Sherwood, 1,000-year-old imagery and history, but beyond that, back to Celtic imagery, Roman imagery, Greek, right back to Stone Age history. And we discussed whether that imagery, in fact, filtered into modern day tarot cards and were still somehow lodged in the collective human psychology, and that is how we related to them, because they somehow traced all the way back to these ancient themes. So that was how originally the work with Cheska began, and out of it grew, you know, some of the ideas that we discussed. For instance, this little, as I said before, was an instance that happened to me in Wales. For those that don't know, in this card, Cheska actually painted herself. That's actually Cheska Potter, being the muse of the water, which I suggested, and being the reflecting mirror in the waterfall. And so a lot of this iconography of those adventures crossed from that into Wildwood tarot as well. So they survived in that imagery as well, i.e. this card, which was directly derived from some of these experiences and adventures while I was researching Arthurian and Robin Hood lore. Anyway, I hope that's been helpful and instructive to some of you folks that don't know the history of it. If you have got any questions, please post them or write to Ali. I'm happy to answer some of them. And again, thank you for everybody that's took time to write nice things on the page and give support to this effort, which, as I said before, is a labour of love. If you think anybody's going to get rich out of this, I've got different news for you. So it's about bringing this back to an audience that appreciates not just the mythos, but everything to do with it. And we've had an idea, which I'm going to expand in the next tape, next video, about tape, that's just dated me, video about the locations. And this is an idea that's come forward about the actual locations where a lot of this work was done. originally in terms of the meditations and the vision questing and everything else that went on in some of the locations, which obviously I was involved with. So that actually was quite an intriguing idea. So I may have more to say about that in the next video, but for the time being, I hope that's been helpful, useful. Thank you again, and we'll see you probably, I don't know, a couple of days maybe. All right, thank you. Happy travels in the Wildwood and the Greenwood.